Hello YouTube, Dave here again. So today I wanted to reminisce about the Eberron campaign that I ran. It was at the time, this was before I ran Shackled City or Age of Worms. So at the time this was actually the campaign that I ran that got the closest to a natural completion. So I was very, very close. There was probably just a few weeks away. I was probably about a couple months away, I think, from finishing it off. But anyway, so it started off with me running the adventure in the campaign setting book, and I actually really liked that adventure. Not that I can remember much about it now, but I ran that, and I also ran the first of the soft-covered adventures, Shadows of the Last War, I think it was. And you know, I started looking over the other adventures, like Whispers of the Vampire's Blade and Grasp of the Emerald Claw, and it's just like, you know, it wasn't the story that I wanted to go with. So in the end, I kind of dropped it, and I didn't run those published adventures, and I skipped the player characters ahead and gave them a few extra levels. But the story that I wanted to run, the inspiration came from a couple different things. Number one, as I had said in yesterday's video, it was the Secrets of Zendrick location with like the toppled giant statue with this throne that you could sit on it and you might receive these visions. And the other thing was an issue of Dragon magazine with the ecology of the Titan. And in that they had a Titan who was like, I guess, this legendary being. And he was so powerful that an entire pantheon of gods sacrificed themselves to trap him in this like divine prison of their creation. And he basically was left to fight these gods for like time immemorial. And so yeah, I just thought it was a really, really cool idea. And I like the idea of, you know, the Titans being, you know, this big powerful early version of the giants. And part of the curse that afflicted Zendrick is that the the generations of giant would slowly like devolve more and more and more. And it was kind of the assumption that, you know, the Titans turned into like, you know, the different types of giants before really getting down to like the hill giants, which are like some of the simplest versions of the giant type or giant race. And but I thought that was a really neat idea, and it just sort of snowballed to, and one of the great things about Eberron is that it leaves a lot of stuff undefined. So what actually caused the decline of the giant civilization? Like what was what events occurred there? Like what terrible cataclysm occurred? And then the other one was the nation of Seer. And, you know, the Day of Mourning, which just the entire country was destroyed. And what was left is this wasteland with this gray, you know, curtain of mist that, you know, you can walk through, and healing magic barely works there, and there's all these other magical oddities, stuff like that. And I wanted to combine those two together. So I wanted to have the event that, you know, having this pantheon of gods sacrifice themselves and you know, to imprison this creature, this powerful Titan lord that was threatening their divinity. And it's sort of what, in my setting anyway, in my version of Eberron, it's what caused the gods to go from being heavily involved like they are in other settings to becoming more of like abstract concepts. And so like the little bit of divine energy that they left behind is what created like the gods that we know in Eberron now, which are much more subtle in their influence. So I had those two events connected. So you had the Pantheon of Giants or gods that sacrificed themselves to take out this giant, or this Titan. And it was actually during the last war that you know, scholars in Seer had learned about this giant and learned about, or this Titan, and learned about his power and how devastating he was. And they attempted to free him, to summon him basically to the material world. And in doing so, the gods that were still locked in this mortal battle with him unleashed a small fraction of their divine fury on that nation. And that's what caused the cataclysm that destroyed Seer, and that's why the like the gray mist kind of stopped at Seer's borders. Instead of, you know, being like a set radius, it just filled out that entire country. and help bring about the end of the war as well, so that people would not be tempted to continue to pursue that sort of concept of trying to free this Titan, and basically bring ruin upon everything. So the campaign actually started out, and that whole story was always kept in the background. So this is something that the player characters didn't really know. They weren't given access to that information. It was something that there was going to be like a revelation at the end. But during the campaign setting adventure, I had introduced an NPC, and it's an NPC name that I use quite often. And the NPC name was Ethan Jasan. And I'd used him again many, many times before, so it was something that players had just sort of naturally associated that name with this benevolent patron of the party. And there was one of the things in Eberron is when it comes to like the Warforged were created in what's called creation forges, which aren't the most imaginative name, but they certainly describe what they are. And it's believed that there are a small number of these forges still in operation. Now, the Treaty of Thronehold, which ended the last war, essentially outlawed the creation of new Warforged, and Warforged were granted freedom, they were granted rights, whereas before they were basically the servant, caste, basically, and they were considered to be disposable even though they had sentience and they had self-awareness, and they weren't just like golems like some of the earlier versions were. And in Sharn, which is where the player started, it's very widely believed, one of the worst kept secrets in all of Corvair, is that the Merix de Cannith, so he's like the head of the Cannith Dragonmarked house in Sharn, that he had one of these creation forges. And so the player characters had a meeting with him where he had thanked them for something that they had done early in, again, I think it was in the published adventures, but he basically kind of warned the player characters away from associating themselves with Ethan. And, Ethan had at one point sent them a letter saying that he was, that he was becoming very fearful. And he believes that Merix was planning on killing him, or wanted him taken out, because he may have let some things slip that Merix didn't want. So he said he was planning an expedition to Zendrick, and he wants to stay there until things kind of blow over, and he wanted the characters to go with him as sort of basically guards, but because he had viewed them as trusted confidants, stuff like that. So the characters arrive, and they see a group of Warforged grabbing Ethan down by these docks on the way to to get on a boat to go to Zendrick, and they drag him to this alley. And so the player characters go in, they defeat the regular Warforged, but then all of a sudden this like wooden barricade gets slams down, and they're in this alleyway with really no other way to get out. But the barricade, it lands and it shatters quite a bit, and there's a lot of damage to it. But then this huge Warforged creature drops down, and this was a Warforged. It's basically a Warforged berserker, and so he was. I think it was actually just large size, but he was a brand new type of Warforged, and the player characters were able to escape from him. Although I think at least one, maybe two of the characters did die during the escape, but they did manage to escape from it, and. One player wanted to switch characters anyway, so he sacrificed himself, and another one was just sort of unlucky in terms of the rolls. And he took quite a bit of damage from the initial fight and decided to go after and fight this, humongous, or this large creature. And unfortunately, he just didn't have the hit points for it, but I digress. So the characters escape. They escape with Ethan, who's still alive, and Ethan basically, tells them that he thinks that that Warforged was newly created by Merix, and thanking them and filling them in on a little bit of what he wanted to do. So it was an expedition to find 3 relics, and they were these large gemstones, 2 of which were referred to as the Titan's Eyes, and another one was referred to as the Titan's Heart. And then there was a 4th location that they had to explore as well. One of the player who created a new character, who wanted to create a new character, had him associated with Ethan from the past. And the last time that this character had seen Ethan was actually when they were at this ruins with the giant monument that was toppled over, and this throne, this massive throne that had granted him visions. So, like the last time that this character had seen him, who was sort of a guide throughout Zendrik, Ethan was sort of like babbling, raving mad. But, he got better. And so they started exploring. They started with that location, and Ethan kind of sat back on the throne and got information as to where they could find these gems. And throughout it all, I actually had Ethan demonstrate inconsistent abilities, and it was something that I wanted to kind of tip the players off that something's not quite right. But so in some fights, some days he was this competent, skilled warrior who was very proficient with blades and wore heavier armor and was a fighter type. In another situation, he was stealthier and was able to pick locks and disarm traps like an accomplished rogue. In another fight, he actually used healing magic, and then in a fourth scenario, the assumption is that he used some sort of arcane magic. So he was always using these really inconsistent abilities. But the characters had gone through, and they had picked up the two eyes and the heart, actually. So they got the three main things that they had first come for, and it was just a matter of getting the fourth item, which they're going to take back to Zendrik, or not to Zendrik, to Sharn with him. And they had spent weeks or even a couple months, I think, exploring at this point. And so this was the adventure where they had the aspect of Dagon and everything that had sort of gone down there, with the party basically getting wiped out to a single character. But I had the other characters just come in as parts of this expedition, so they would have had access to all the same information. But unfortunately, that's kind of where I left things off. So they went through a couple of ruins. They encountered a group of the Zendrik Drow, which were, unlike regular Drow that we're used to, instead of worshipping spiders, they kind of venerate scorpions, and it's more of a patriarchal society. So I think they fought some of those and gotten one of the gems. They got the other one from the Kuatoa, worshippers of Dagon, and they found the heart somewhere, and I can't remember exactly where that was, unfortunately. And this was at the time, this had reached the point where I just couldn't really maintain a regular campaign anymore. I was really burnt out. This is when I was working 14-hour days, essentially, from the time that I would get up to the time that I got home. It was actually probably closer to 15 hours, actually. And I was doing this for months. And it was really taking its toll. So it eventually just got to the point where I just didn't have the mental energy to continue with that campaign. But I did have everything outlined. And that was one of those things that, it's not because I ran out of ideas. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I just didn't have the energy to sit down and design it or run it. So if any of the players in that campaign are watching, this is what was going to happen after that. So the last part of exploring Zendrik was to find this stone sarcophagus, and inside the sarcophagus was the physical remains of this great titan whose spirit was ripped away and trapped by these gods to prevent him from essentially destroying everything. And the heart and the eyes were actually his physical eyes and heart that were removed, and they couldn't be destroyed, so they were removed and spread across the continent. The only way to bring him back was through this ritual, and you had to procure all 4 items. And one of the things about the Drow, actually, the Drow Guardians, was nobody used Detect Alignment or Detect Evil or anything, but they actually weren't evil. They were neutral. They weren't good either, but they weren't evil. So they were actually entrusted as guardians. The Kuatoa were evil, but the eye wasn't originally in their possession. It was something that they had actually acquired and managed to stash away. And the heart, I can't remember where the heart was. I was really trying to rack my brains to figure out where the heart was, and I honestly can't remember. But the party did find it. And so they had to find the stone, sarcophagus, which had the body. The sarcophagus was at the bottom of this 5-layer dungeon. And I wanted this to be like an old school dungeon crawl, because it had been a while since I had done one of those. So I wanted to create 5 different levels with their own theme, their own creature types. And but again, one of the interesting things is that none of them were going to detect as evil. If anyone tried to use that, or if they had that class feature or ability, it wasn't going to function. They weren't going to detect as evil, because they're actually guardians appointed by those gods, and the responsibilities were kind of passed down. So anyway, that was sort of the premise there, and they would go through each of these levels, and they would finally find the sarcophagus. Now, in order to do the ritual, it required certain things that Ethan didn't feel comfortable taking to Zendrik. So the idea was to bring the sarcophagus with the giant, the Titan's body inside, along with the gems, and he was going to complete the ritual there. So what was going to end up happening was, when they arrived back in Sharn, Ethan was going to have everything sent to his home. And, he stayed behind for a little bit, and, got like a meal or something with the player characters. Either way, there was going to be a bit of a time delay between when the stuff was offloaded from the boat and when the next event was going to occur, which was another one of these, another encounter where a pair of these Warforged berserkers were going to attack, and in the process, Ethan was going to be killed. And that was going to be it. He was just, going to end up being dead. And, or so the characters thought. And, with his dying breath, basically, or as he was discussing before the attack, is that he's still concerned about Merrick's, and the possibility that Merrick still holds a grudge for whatever reasons, and try to come up with a story as to why. And it would revolve around this idea of this creation forge. And then that's when, these Warforged berserkers would attack, and Ethan would be killed, or again, so they thought. So the player characters would make their, the idea was that they would want to seek revenge, and go back to Merrick's tower, and basically they would get there, and they would fight like a few human guards and stuff, but that would be, there wasn't a lot of resistance. And they would actually make it all the way to Merrick's chambers, or his, probably not his chambers, but his office. And they would find him there, again, unprotected by any of these Warforged, which would hopefully get the characters wondering, like, if he can create these things, why aren't they here? Or why doesn't he have more of them? Why aren't there any Warforged here, sort of idea. And that's when the revelation was going to kick in, that the person that they thought was Ethan wasn't actually Ethan. It was a doppelganger that he had sent in his absence, or in his place. And the doppelganger had a prestige class called Chameleon, which was in the Races of Destiny, I think. And what that is it's available to humans or doppelgangers only. And it allows them to change their class types every day, I think. So when they wake up every morning, they can change their focus. So they could have a martial focus, they could have a skill focus, they could have divine focus or arcane focus. So they could basically emulate any of these classes. And that would sort of go to explain all of the inconsistent times where, Ethan, when they were adventuring with him, would use this myriad of abilities that he shouldn't be able to switch between. And so Merrick's would sort of fill them in about, his allegiance with this doppelganger, and what this doppelganger was able to do, and information that he learned about Ethan, and his obsession with bringing back this Titan, and how it's believed that a previous attempt to, rip the spirit of this Titan away from the gods that had imprisoned it is what led to the Day of Mourning. In that, it's possible that if Ethan completes or tries to attempt this ritual, that it could do the same thing for Sharn, and possibly all of Thrain, I think. I think Thrain is the nation that Sharn is in. So it was going to be bad news. So the player characters would have to scramble to part of like the lower city where Ethan's residence was, and have this sort of climactic battle there, where at the end his ritual was likely going to be interrupted, but they would still have to fight like this powerful undead version of this Titan, very, very stripped down, but it's still going to be a very, very powerful creature. And then that was going to be the end of the campaign. So it was sort of, you know, as it turns out, the real Ethan had stayed behind to prepare everything. And they you know, it would end with Ethan's either his death or capture and the destruction of this undead Titan. So anyway, that was the Eberron campaign that I had designed. It was the Eberron campaign setting that I got pretty close to finishing. All that I had to do was the I think I even ran the first floor of that 5-floor dungeon, and so all I had to do was the other floors, and they weren't huge. Like, they weren't 40-room floors. They were, I think, like 10 to 15-room floors. So I could have gotten, I think, through each one of those levels in a session, since we were gaming, I think, on average around 6 hours back then. So anyway, that was my Eberron adventure. That was my Eberron campaign. You know, not the greatest, I guess, in the world, but it was something that I was actually really happy with at the time, and it was a shame I never got to finish it. Because again, it wasn't for a lack of ideas, it was just a lack of energy and being like just really, really burnt out by the extremely long work days I was putting in for months on end. So anyway, so there you go. So if you guys have ever run a campaign or adventures in Eberron, let me know what some of your stories are. I look forward to reading them. If you have a YouTube channel and you're watching this and you have some experience running stuff in Eberron, maybe do a video response, and I'd love to hear your stories. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next time. Take care.